Welcome to this webinar on how to set expected growth targets using the Circle Assessment and/or TXT-KEA. At the time that Cohort D districts submitted their application for the teacher incentive allotment, there was a misunderstanding about whether the Circle Assessment and the TXT-KEA provided expected growth targets for students. At the time, many districts, as well as the TIA team, believed that this was the case. However, we've since learned that neither the Circle Assessment nor the TXT-KEA set expected growth targets. Both tests do provide nationally normed benchmark cut points, however, that districts can use as a reference when setting their own expected growth targets locally. The TIA team has responded to this new information with a variety of steps. First, we corrected all references on our website to either of these tests that included information that said they set expected growth targets, since it is now clear that they do not. Two, we sent an email to all Cohort D districts with this information and some options for how to set expected growth targets locally. Third, we hosted office hours for affected Cohort D districts on 2 different days in late January. And fourth, we are recording this webinar. It is our hope that this response will be helpful to districts to be able to address the additional task of setting expected growth targets locally, a task that districts now have to undertake, even though at the time of their application they did not expect to have to do so. This issue affects districts all around the state from all 20 regions. I want to pause and point out that districts are not required to use Circle or TXT-KEA for the purpose of TIA. However, for districts that do choose to use Circle and/or TXT-KEA for their TIA local designation system, they will need to set expected growth targets locally. It is also important to point out that there are early childhood reporting requirements. These measures could be used as part of a district's local designation system, or they could be completely separate. For example, there are early childhood reporting requirements for kindergarten that require a literacy screener that must be either the TXT-KEA or M-Class test. However, districts could choose to use an entirely different student growth measure to measure the effectiveness of their kindergarten teachers, such as SLOs or portfolios, and are not required to use the literacy screener for purposes of TIA. That is a local decision. There is also a required literacy screener for pre-kindergarten, which could be any of the assessments from the Commissioner's approved list of pre-kindergarten assessments, and must include assessment in the 5 required domains for pre-kindergarten. For districts that do choose to use the Circle test for the required early childhood reporting option, here is some guidance. Required early childhood reporting must be entered in the Early Childhood Data System, or ECDS. For pre-kindergarten, there are 5 required domains. Each domain has specific tests, and some have subtests within the domain. Measuring student growth in pre-K for purposes of TIA, however, does not necessarily require the use of the measure for the required ECDS reporting. Districts have choices. They don't have to use Circle at all. They can use the required reporting test and the subtests. They can use additional tests beyond the required tests in the 5 domains, or they could use a different test entirely, or they could use a completely different growth measure and not use a test at all. The required measures on the Circle test for early childhood reporting in ECDS include tests in language and communication, emergent literacy reading, emergent literacy writing, mathematics, and health and wellness. Tests are available in both English and Spanish. In addition to what is required, there are also recommended tests that districts could consider for the purposes of their ECDS reporting. These include additional tests in the domains of language and communication and emergent literacy reading. So, for the purposes of TIA, districts first need to decide which tests or subtests will they use to measure student growth for pre-K. Again, it's important to point out that districts could use the required tests for ECDS, additional tests such as the recommended tests, or additional tests that the district deems to be the most effective at measuring student growth for pre-kindergarten students. You can find a list of all the Circle subtests on the Circle website, and there's a link provided at the bottom of this slide. Here's an example of what one district decided to do. Zinnia ISD decided to use, for their TIA plan, all of the required tests that they have to use anyway for purposes of ECDS. But they also added in the set of phonological awareness tests and subtests because they felt that the addition of these two phonological awareness tests really captured the district-wide focus on literacy and aligned very well with their Reading Academy work. Here are some benefits and considerations for Zinnia ISD's plan. First, it makes use of the 5 required tests they have to give anyway for purposes of early childhood reporting. Second, it aligns with their district focus. And third, it aligns with their Reading Academy work. Some considerations could be, are the required 5 tests that comprise the literacy screen for pre-K really the best measure of teacher effectiveness for pre-kindergarten teachers? What are the implications of adding on the phonological awareness tests and subtests to the original required 5 tests? What would be the effect on students? How might this affect teacher workload? And finally, are there any reliability concerns the district might have about the results of teacher-administered tests? Here's another example of what one district decided to do. Lantana ISD is implementing all 5 of the required ECDS tests for pre-K. However, they've decided not to use any of them for purposes of TIA. Instead, after consulting with their early childhood experts and their pre-K teachers themselves, they decided to implement a portfolio system and measure student growth for their pre-K students with a portfolio of their work products over the course of the year. Here are some benefits to Lantana ISD's plan. First, it is grounded in actual student work instead of a test. Second, it removes the unpredictability factor when testing 4-year-olds. Third, it allows for multiple sources of data in the portfolio beyond just the 2 test scores from Wave 1 to Wave 3. Some things for Lantana ISD to consider are, what kind of workload will it be to create a portfolio system? Who will do the work? And when? What kind of additional work will this place on district staff, campus leaders, teachers? And finally, might there be some way to use the circle tests since they have to give them anyway? Once you have determined that you want to use the circle test in some way, and you've determined which tests and subtests you want to use, it is time to decide how exactly you will determine expected growth using the tests and subtests that you selected. Here are 3 possible options you could consider. We will discuss each one of these in detail. The first is using the circle benchmark cut points to determine the overall point gain from Wave 1 to Wave 3. The second is to count students who remain on track for their respective age band as having met expected growth. The third is to determine the district's actual growth from Wave 1 to Wave 3, and then use that growth data to set expected growth targets. You can reference the circle benchmark cut points at the link provided on this slide. In this example from the rapid letter naming test, you can see that the on-track cut score from Wave 1 to Wave 3 increased by 7 points. So districts could apply this 7-point gain to whatever a student's starting score was at Wave 1 in order to determine an expected growth score for Wave 3. On the left, you can see 5 sample students, students A through E. You can see their Wave 1 scores respectively in the second column. Their expected growth targets were calculated by adding 7 points, the overall point gain from Wave 1 to Wave 3, based on the benchmark cut points, to their Wave 1 score. So for student A, whose Wave 1 score was a 7, the expected growth target is a 7 plus a 7, or 14. You can then compare their expected growth target to their actual Wave 3 score to determine if the students met their expected growth target or not. For example, student B, whose expected growth target was a 14, but whose actual Wave 3 score was an 11, did not meet expected growth. However, student C, whose expected growth score was a 12, and whose actual Wave 3 score was a 12, did meet expected growth. Another method districts could use if determining students are on track for their respective age band at the end of the year. There are 4 different age bands identified based on how old students were as of September 1st. Using these age bands, district could define growth as being on track, either growing to on track or remaining on track for their respective age band by the end of the year. This chart shows the respective age bands as of September 1st and the scores required to be on track at the beginning of the year, Wave 1, and at the end of the year, Wave 3. In this table, you can see 4 students, 1 in each of the 4 age bands identified on the circle benchmarks. Based on their age band, expected growth can be defined as being on track by the end of the year for their respective age band. For example, student B began the year between 3.5 and 4 years old. For this age band, an on-track score for Wave 3 would be a 12. However, this student's actual Wave 3 score was a 10, so this student did not meet expected growth. Another method that districts could use is to determine their actual district growth from the beginning of the year to the end of the year instead of using the circled benchmark cut points. In this example, the district calculated their actual average student growth from Wave 1 to Wave 3 and determined that their students had an average 10-point gain from Wave 1 to Wave 3 on the rapid letter naming test, as opposed to the national benchmark cut point of a 7-point gain. So they used their average growth of a 10-point gain instead. In this table, you can see students' Wave 1 scores and their expected growth targets, which is their Wave 1 score plus the 10-point average growth for this district. Districts then can look at students' actual Wave 3 score and determine if they met their expected growth or not. We will now look at some methods for setting expected growth targets using TXT-KEA. Similar to the circle test, there is a required test for ECDS reporting, which is a literacy screener that consists of 3 subtests: vocabulary, letter names, and spelling. Additional tests beyond the 3 tests that are required for the literacy screen are recommended. There are additional tests in the language and communication domain, the emergent literacy reading domain. Similar to the circle assessment as well, the first decision districts need to make is which of the various subtests they want to use for purposes of their TIA plan. There are a variety of tests and subtests to choose from. For a full list of all available tests that TXT-KEA offers, consult the link at the bottom of this slide. Best practice is to use a combination of subtests in addition to the required literacy screener. Again, the required literacy screener involves 3 tests: vocabulary, letter names, and spelling. For purposes of TIA, we would encourage using additional subtests beyond the literacy screener. There are several domains for the TXT-KEA test. All of this can be found on the TXT-KEA website. The domains include language, literacy, STEM, social emotional, executive function, and academic motor skills. Some possible combinations for tests and subtests that districts could use for purposes of TIA are listed below. One district chose to use the 3 subtests required for the literacy screener and add in the listening comprehension subtests. Another district chose to use the 3 subtests required for the literacy screen and also add in one of the STEM subtests. Another district chose to use all of the language tests and all of the literacy tests, which totals 9 tests in all. And yet another district decided they choose to use the literacy screen and add in one of the executive function subtests. These are all just sample ways that a district could decide to combine possible TXT-KEA subtests to measure student growth in kindergarten for the purposes of TIA. As an example, Hydrangea ISD plans to use the required literacy screen test, which is 3 subtests, and add in all 3 executive function subtests because they feel that together this combination more closely measures growth in kindergarten overall and includes measures beyond literacy. Some benefits for Hydrangea ISD's plan are that it aligns to their literacy goals for their district, it aligns to their social emotional goals for their kindergarten students, and it makes use of the required screener that they have to give anyway. Some considerations might be, what are the implications of adding in additional tests? What additional training and monitoring will be needed for teachers and campus leaders? And how will the district ensure reliable results with the additional added tests? We will now discuss some possible ways to set expected growth targets using TXT-KEA. TXT-KEA also has benchmark cut points. There are 3 levels: needs support, monitor, and on track. You can download the TXT-KEA benchmark using the link on this slide. 2 possible methods to use are moving up a band or remaining on track, according to the published TXT-KEA benchmarks, and determining the average growth at the district level using actual student data from your district to calculate your own average growth instead of using the benchmarks. In this method, moving up a band or remaining on track, districts could define expected growth as moving up a band or remaining on track. Using the 3 performance bands in the TXT test, districts could set expected growth as moving from needs support to monitor, moving from monitor to on track, or staying on track. Please note that being on track at the end of the year does represent growth because the end of the year test includes end of year content, so being on track at the end of the year by definition represents growth compared to the beginning of the year. It is important to note that in the TXKEA benchmarks for some tests, the on-track score for Wave 3 is actually lower than the on-track score for Wave 1, which at first glance may seem counterintuitive. However, since the Wave 3 test is a more challenging test covering more advanced content than in Wave 1, in some cases a lower score in Wave 3 really does represent growth. Here is an example. For the vocabulary subtest, you can see that the Wave 1 on-track score is a 10, but the Wave 3 on-track score is a 6, which appears to signal lower proficiency. However, since the Wave 3 vocabulary subtest includes more advanced vocabulary than the Wave 1 test, a score of 6 really does represent growth. On the other hand, for the listening comprehension test, the Wave 1 on-track score is an 11, and the Wave 3 on-track score is a 14. So for this test, the growth from Wave 1 to Wave 3 more directly signals an increase. One way to use the TXT benchmarks is to use the names of the performance bands instead of the numbers, since the numbers vary by test. In this example, there are 5 students, students A through E. You can see their Wave 1 band in the second column. So for student A, for example, her Wave 1 score was needs support. Her expected growth target then was set at monitor, which would mean the student would have moved up 1 performance band by the end of the year. In the fourth column, you can see student's actual Wave 3, which for student A was monitor. The last column indicates if the student met their expected growth target or not. Student A, whose expected growth target was monitor, and whose Wave 3 score indeed was monitor, met her expected growth. Take a minute to review this chart for students B through E. In other words, instead of using the cut points from the TXKEA benchmark chart, districts could use the color-coded performance band system instead. So moving from red to yellow would be moving up a band. Moving from yellow to green would be moving up a performance band. And remaining green by the end of Wave 3, which means the student is on track at the end of the year, also would count as students meeting expected growth. All of these conditions could signal meeting expected growth. A different method districts could use is to calculate their own average district growth instead of using their nationally normed cut points or the performance bands from TXKEA. This is similar to the method we use with the circle test, where districts calculate their own average score of their kindergarten students at the beginning of the year in Wave 1. Then at the end of the year, districts would calculate the average score of kindergarten students on the Wave 3 test. Using these 2 data points, districts could calculate the average growth for a kindergarten student over the course of the year. Then districts could apply that average growth points to the student's Wave 1 score to calculate students' expected growth target. Here is an example from one Texas district. In this district, their average Wave 1 score was a 14, and their average Wave 3 score was a 22. This represents an 8-point gain from Wave 1 to Wave 3. In this district, they used the literacy screener subtests and the language subtests, and they averaged all of those scores from Wave 1 to Wave 3 to come up with the average point gain in their district for their students, which was 8 points. The district then applied this 8-point gain to students' Wave 1 score to determine their expected growth target. Let's look at student E. Student E had a Wave 1 score of 7. Adding in the average district growth of 8 points, the student E's initial score of 7 yields an expected growth target of 15. In this case, student E's actual Wave 3 score at the end of the year was an 18, so student E met his expected growth target. Take a moment to review this chart for students A through D. Thank you for your time and for viewing this webinar. We hope that it will give you some options to consider for how you want to set expected growth targets locally if your TIA local designation system included using the circle test for pre-kindergarten and or the TXT test for kindergarten. We appreciate your time. If you have any further questions, please see the guidance on this topic posted on the TIA website at tiatexas.org or email us at the TIA inbox at tia@tea.texas.gov. Thank you.